I mean, same.
I wonder if you can sort of I don't know to what extent they want this to be
Well, I mean, this is answering the question. You're still answering it. I'm finally got my head around how I'm going to differentiate sources and drivers. This is the first question. Spreads in values of different key variables that need to be computed to get to the facts. Drivers has a certain relationship between each outcome along the chain, so to speak. So the source of uncertainty the spread of value between each outcome and the driver of uncertainty. The expression sort of how is that uncertainty just models that we create that links it all together. Well, I was
and the other one was slash like cause and time out in the future. Cause and effect.
because like otherwise actually I would just like need to change it to
One of the panelists still hasn't arrived, so we might give them a couple of minutes. Are you? Is that okay? Okay, so do you want me to just say we'll start when you're live?
yeah. Yes.
You know what I mean?
That sounds like a good idea.
Maybe also let us speak to
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take a seat.
It's like getting a
Do you want us sitting down?
Yes, please. Yeah, do take your seat.
I haven't had anything. I'm just going to riff off what you say. That's all.
I just realised I was going to say 5 minutes ago. Thankfully I didn't tell yesterday.
The mics are probably live.
Top mic.
automatic.
Oh, you got time, Nick? Sorry?
It's been here for a long time.
Yeah, let's see.
Just wait another minute for people to take their seats, and one of our panelists has been caught in the chaos on the circle line this morning, which is completely broken down. So we'll get started in 30 seconds. Okay, we'll get going. So, welcome everyone to this special event, looking back at COP25. And we've decided to describe this event as setting the stage for raising ambition in 2020. Welcome here to the London School of Economics and Political Science. This is an event organised by the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And I'm Bob Ward, the Policy and Communications Director. And we're very lucky to have here a panel of 5 participants in the Madrid Climate Change Summit, which was the longest session of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since they started in 1992. Not a record that's really sought after. It finished at lunchtime on Sunday, and we're very lucky that our 5 participants have all made the time to come and join us. We're also joined live on the web this morning, as well as by an audience here at LSE. We're going to start, I'll introduce the panel. They'll each have 10 minutes to provide, or up to 10 minutes to provide some introductory comments, and then we'll go to a Q&A. Most of this is looking back and trying to interpret what happened in Madrid, but we'll also be asking people to look forward to COP26, which will be held in November in Glasgow, with the UK as the president of the COP. So, let me start with the panel. We start with, on my immediate left, Archie Young, who is Director and Lead Negotiator for the UK in the negotiations, and he's based in the UK Cabinet Office. On Archie's left is Professor Lord Nicholas Stern, who is chair of both the Grantham Research Institute and the ESRC Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy here at LSE. On Nick's left is Pete Betts, who is a visiting professor in practice here at the Grantham Research Institute, but was formerly chief EU negotiator and director for International Climate and Energy at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. On Pete's left is Dr. Elena Avadchenkova, who is a distinguished policy fellow here at the Grantham Research Institute. And we will be joined shortly, hopefully, by Salam Kadane Abebe, who is a legal advisor to the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change and a PhD candidate at the University of Reading, and who has been caught in traffic this morning, travelling from Reading. So, I'm going to start by asking Archie to provide up to 10 minutes of his interpretation of what's happened in Madrid. So over to you, Archie.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Is that on? Perfect. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Bob. And it's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel. And it's noticeable how many people have stopped me in the corridor this morning and said, "You survived," or "Are you okay?" And I think that reflects on the marathon session that we've just come out of. As Bob said, I think the latest stats are that it overran by 42 hours. Virtually no sleep in that overrunning. Although somebody did, when I was giving the kind of thank you at the end after we'd been formally nominated for COP presidency next year. Somebody tweeted that I was looking remarkably fresh, which actually was the nicest thing anybody said to me for the whole 2 weeks. So that was very good.
They were just being nice.
I know. Well, they did also question whether I'd actually, maybe I'd been asleep while everybody else was negotiating. But as ever, double-edged sword on Twitter. No, so it was a marathon session, and I think we have to start by giving credit to Chile and also to Spain. The circumstances of this COP, the fact that it was moved from Santiago to Madrid, and in a few weeks, both governments were able to work together and actually enable the COP to happen, and enable the COP to happen in its fullest. So we had the full negotiations, very much full. We also had the full side event program, all the country pavilions, a full green zone where the kind of trade fair and the action agenda was very much present. And I think that's important because one of the reasons that Spain gave for responding to that call in that way was they simply said, well, it couldn't not happen. And that was their view, was that given the urgency, given the clamour on the streets for greater climate action, given the clarity of the science, it was inconceivable that we wouldn't gather the countries of the world together to try to push things forward and find solutions. But we have to be honest as well that the end outcome is mixed. I think that the main thing that we wanted to get out of it was to finalise those outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook, to really give that signal a springboard for ambition for 2020, and also to position ourselves and listen and consult as to what countries wanted to see, but not just countries, businesses, stakeholders, civil society, indigenous people, young people, what they want out of COP26. And I was very pleased that there were no hiccups. The UK was formally accepted as the host of COP26. And it's striking how many people are now saying how much work we have on our hands for the year ahead. But I said that it was a mixed result and that it was the longest ever. And I think that longest ever element highlights one of the most common threads of conversations over the 2 weeks, which was people describing a disconnect. The slogan of the COP was time to act. And the symbol was a ticking clock. And I must confess that given that it overran by so long, at one point, quite late in the morning, several people were questioning whether actually we as negotiators were heeding that logo and whether we were really recognising the urgency of the situation. So there was a disconnect there, but also just the question of the disconnect between the voices in the street, the increasing attention on climate change, the increasing demand from citizens around the world, the march in Madrid, various estimates as to exactly how many people were there, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets, calling on us to do more and go further. So that was the kind of context. I think when you look at the result, like I say, mixed. I'll start with some of the positives because definitely certain elements were agreed which are important and which we can build on. And there was kind of technical progress made even in those elements which didn't formally reach conclusion. A few areas where I would point to progress being made. The first is on loss and damage, a very politically charged issue, but we were able to conclude that item. We were able to agree how that work would go forward so that we can increase the understanding and coordination of efforts to address the most extreme impacts of climate change. A gender action plan was agreed, which for us was one of our priorities and hugely important. The local indigenous peoples platform, that was also agreed. There was also, it was agreed that next year in Bonn, there will be dialogues on ocean and also on land, which will reflect on the recent IPCC special reports on those issues. So that's helpful as a way of making sure that the process is able to consider those reports and take things forward. And also there was a signal on ambition for next year. It was limited in that it didn't go further than Paris. It didn't strengthen that call for all countries to come forward with enhanced nationally determined contributions next year, as we expect them to do so. But it was there, and we have the hook for a synthesis report, and it's something that we can build on as incoming presidency. But inevitably, a lot of the attention in the media and a lot of the attention that we're focusing on is those elements which did not come to a successful conclusion. The most remarked upon of those is carbon markets, and I'm very happy to go into the detail of corresponding adjustments and transition and share of proceeds and overall mitigation ambition, etc. But I suspect that probably this isn't the audience for that. But suffice to say, there are some seriously difficult technical and political issues in how to agree the three elements of carbon markets that need to be taken forward. One is Article 6.2, which is international transfers of mitigation outcomes, how countries will transfer and trade mitigation outcomes between each other, and how you adjust your NDC either if you have bought or you have sold. Also 6.4, the new mechanism that will replace the clean development mechanism. How you transition from the old one into the new one, what you do with the outstanding activities and credits and units from the old one, and so on. But then also what you do with these transactions. Do you put a share of proceeds, so kind of transaction tax, if you like, in order to increase the funding for adaptation? Do you also take a haircut to make sure that each time there is a transaction that actually the atmosphere benefits by reducing the emissions that are being allowed through that? So those are some of the technical issues that were present in that. And I think one of the elements that's really interesting in that debate is you have the desire to create these markets and to make them work, but doing so in the context of a Paris Agreement framework where you have nationally determined contributions. So normally when setting up a market, you would want, as far as possible, people to be trading in the same currency. You would want there to be transparency such that you could take something from one balance into the other and take off one and put into another. You would want to have that clarity that there wouldn't be double counting, that there would be integrity in the transitions. And also, you would want to start that market off afresh so that it wasn't full of the hot air or some of the less integral activities and units from previous mechanisms. And I think that's the balance that we're trying to take here, which is how do you create these new elements in the context of the systems and the regimes that we've set up. And it's not straightforward. And I think there was a point when it looked like a deal might have been possible, which gives me hope for next year. But in the end, it didn't make it across the line. And in the end, you will have seen that the UK signed up to the San Jose Principles, which set out the elements that we would like to see in a functioning carbon market, such that we could have that confidence that there would be no double counting, that there would be no hot air, and that it would be fit for purpose and able to function. Some of the other elements that didn't conclude in the way that we would have hoped. One is transparency of reporting, where the work that was agreed in Katowice last year and which will continue on to Glasgow next year, those conversations, they did not progress as far as we would have liked, and we need to do more over the course of the next year to bring them back into the place they need to be. And then also on long-term finance, where that actually got quite difficult in the very last moments when there was some confusion and various accusations about exactly how that had ended. I was very pleased that the lead negotiator for the Africa Group referenced the UK actually in terms of our commitment to long-term finance. And I think over the next year ahead, we need to make sure that collectively this doesn't become a race to the bottom or some trade-off between ambition and finance, but that we are clear that long-term finance is on the agenda for next year. It is something that we want to discuss. We are committed to the $100 billion collective goal, that we are committed to discussing in good faith exactly what follows that. And we need to work together to make sure that there is finance reaching the people who need it most, both year ahead but also much beyond. But I think some of those elements highlight one of the tensions that we have, which is this moment coming as we are a couple of weeks before the end of 2019. And a lot of these issues, they highlight that we're in this transition phase as a system from pre-2020, the Kyoto period, through to post-2020, the new Paris period. And through that, you see that in carbon markets in terms of the transition from the old system to the new. You see that in terms of the finalization of the Paris rulebook. You see that in some of the narratives around ambition, where some countries are saying, well, we won't look at our own ambition for next year until we have fully understood what has or hasn't been delivered in the pre-2020 period. So that, I think that transition kind of point from pre-2020 to post-2020 is running through a lot of these issues. I focused a lot on the negotiations. That is obviously where I spent most of my time. Of course, it's not all negotiations. There was a huge amount going on outside of the negotiations. Some of the things that, from the UK perspective, were particularly powerful and important to us. One was that the UK joined Chile as the co-leads for the Ambition Alliance, which brings together the various strands of ambition, both by governments but also by non-state actors, and has lists of those countries and entities that are pledging to go net zero, pledging to come forward with new nationally determined contributions next year, pledging to put in place new policies and measures to go further faster. And that will absolutely be a central focus of us over the next year. Also, the action agenda more broadly, there was a huge amount going on so many different issues. One of the things I always regret at COPs is that there are so many different events that it reminds me actually of my first week at university when I looked at the lecture schedule and I told myself that I was going to go to all these interesting lectures in all these other rooms. And if I'm honest, I kind of barely able to get to the ones that actually I was responsible for or that I was supposed to be studying. But you have this idea of you can visit all these different pavilions and hear all these fantastic speakers. We had a UK pavilion. We had over 60 events attended by over 2,000 people. We did so in partnership with the Italians, given our partnership for next year, whereby our pavilions were next to each other. And their coffee machine somehow just seamlessly managed to connect to our pavilion, which is, I think, one of the best decisions we made. We had Lord Duncan, the Minister for International Climate Change. He was present, as was Claire Perry-O'Neill, the COP26 President designate. And we were very visible. We were involved in the High Ambition Coalition. We convened the Cartagena Dialogue. We tried to get that progressive group of countries working together, as well as doing full bilateral program. We had representatives from DFID, from DEFRA, from DFT, from Treasury, Cabinet Office, so the whole of government was there. We were, of course, constrained by the fact that we were in the pre-election period, so we didn't have the same number of announcements and speeches that we might have done, but we were still determined to be visible and active. So we look ahead now to next year. We recognise that the eyes of the world are on us. But I think before we have been doing a lot of planning for next year. But also we knew that we would need to properly take stock as to what had happened in Madrid. And I think given that mixed result, we really do need to take that time to reflect. It's very clear that there is appetite for looking at how we can do things differently. But also there is an absolutely important mandate of delivering on those elements that have been, were either originally intended for Glasgow or those elements that have been pushed forward to Glasgow. So we are determined to do that. It will be a whole of government effort, but also not just government. We will need everybody in this room, all of the UK civil society, all of our networks of businesses and champions and people who are proving that tackling climate change is both a moral and an economic and a social and a political good. And we will need that message to go out loud and strong all around the world, because we have some heavy lifting to do for the year ahead, but we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archie. And I can also confirm that the UK Pavilion featured a bagpipe player on Friday morning to celebrate the UK taking over. It wasn't entirely welcomed by those who were nursing headaches after watching the election through the night before. But we'll now turn to, we've been joined by Salam, and I'm going to give her a few moments to gather her thoughts. So I'm going to ask Pete next, if he would like to give a few thoughts.
Well, thanks very much, Bob, and it's great to be in the position of being able to say some of what I really think now that I'm no longer a bureaucrat. Archie has given you a much more authoritative assessment of what happened sort of within the small rooms than I could, and I endorse what he said. So let me say a few things about the COP itself. First. Secondly, just stand back a little bit from the COP and think, well, what did that mean? And who got what they wanted and who didn't. And then thirdly, just something about what some of the lessons possibly for the UK presidency in this coming, or pre-presidency in this coming year. So on the COP itself, I mean, standing back, well, you, as Archie sort of implies, you would expect a COP at this point in the cycle to be a difficult one. You know, usually in the year before a big COP, difficult countries will be difficult, and they will flex their muscles, and they will try to lower expectations for the big COP next year, and they will also try and keep as many bargaining chips back as they can. So that's, and they'll also want to blur the focus on the big issue next year, which is raising ambition of NDCs. I think also with a weakened US, I think the US was still active, but they clearly don't have the same authority. That was another factor. And I would also say that there's a sort of gap in understanding. I think some countries have always thought that the carbon markets was a big lever, a big negotiating chip with the EU, which it isn't. The EU doesn't need Article 6 to do its engaging carbon markets. It can do that anyway. Paris allows all countries to do that anyway. The reason that the EU wants Article 6 is to try to put some minimum environmental integrity standards around what other people do. For example, when the Japanese were double counting carbon market activity with host countries. So I think that there's probably sort of a bit of sort of dissonance there. So that was, to be expected. And yet, the media reporting, as usual, was, oh, disaster, it's not close the gap. It was never intended to close the gap. This meeting was never about that. Jill was saying to me earlier, I agree, Jill Duggan. So, but that isn't helpful to have that kind of reporting. I guess it also, to me, it also illustrates, and I'm not sure everybody gets this, including the kids on the street, that the politics here around climate change are very different from the politics in China or India or Africa. I'll be corrected on this, but I don't think that most young people in Africa are thinking about climate change. I'm afraid. I think they're thinking about where their next job's coming from, or where their next. And I think the same is India and China. Of course, there are youth movements in these places, but I don't think the politics is the same, and I think we have to take account of that. So let's just sort of stand back secondly and think. What did Europe and its allies want, including the UK, and what did some of the more difficult countries want? Well, I suppose what Europe wanted to do was clear the decks on the rule set, what was left of the rule set, get that out of the way so that we could focus on the ambition-raising process next year. Secondly, Europe and the UK wanted to build pressure, collective pressure towards this ambition-raising moment next year, raise expectations, make everybody feel that they had to come with a revised NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. You have to say that's hard, and we all know why that's hard. It's hard with the US out of the game, and it does. Although no one's followed US out of Paris, they have a huge gravitational pull. So, we've heard countries like Japan saying they're not going to raise their ambition, Australia saying they're not going to raise their ambition next year. Brazil is clearly feeling comfort from the position of the US. So it's really hard to do that. And I suppose another thing that the EU-UK wants is to try to build alliances, particularly with vulnerable countries, to try and help build that pressure. So if you then look at what do some of the big emerging economies want, or some of the countries who don't want to be under pressure next year, well, they want to dilute the pressure. They want to dilute any global pressure next year to raise ambition. They want to try to make common cause with developing countries. So they want to make it a developing versus developed country fight. They always want that. The EU will always want to try to ally with the vulnerable countries. The big emerging economies will want to pull the vulnerable countries over to their side. So what did we get? Well, you have to say that, largely speaking, the difficult countries won. The rule set is not out of the way. We have a very weak decision text, essentially saying that countries need to consider, I think it says, the gap in terms of raising NDC ambition next year. And I think we also have a sense that, again, I'll be corrected on this. I heard when I was there, and I was only there for a few days, mostly drinking coffee, but I heard a fair amount of dissatisfaction from sort of African countries, for example, about the way that the finance discussions had perceived to be played, a sense that the developed countries hadn't delivered, a bit of dissatisfaction about loss and damage. We did hear some strong voices from vulnerable countries. We heard, particularly from AOSIS, Belize, Marshall Islands, sort of not just talking about developed countries, but talking about the need for all the big emitters to raise ambition. But I didn't think that came through as strongly as it might have done. So, just thirdly, what are the lessons for the COP? Now, I'm not for the UK presidency for next year. Now, I'm not talking to Archie here because everything I'm going to say he knows. The COP is a big thing. A UK minister described it on mic as a circus. I don't think that's wise. It is a huge extravaganza, and it's when you come to this afresh, you can look at it and think it's just crazy and it can't deliver anything. I think the UK would be very unwise to draw that lesson and to think it could dismiss the COP and the COP process. Yes, it's true that a lot of what has to happen next year will have to happen outside the COP, raising ambition, some of the big real economy plays, but the COP matters and COP policies and COP politics matter. COP politics will inform everything it's possible to do on climate change, and if you disregard that at your peril would be one message I would give. Second, and I know this is happening, we've got to kind of build the politics. We've got to engage bilaterally and constructively with the big emitters. There's a lot going on with China. The EU is particularly engaging with China. There's a big summit next year in Leipzig, which is going to be attended at head of government level on both sides. I think that's very important. So and the UK needs to do that as well, with India, with some of the other big emerging economies. So that's the second thing. But the third thing is, we have to get much smarter at delivering on some of the big developing country asks. So that is harder with the US not on board, but it looks like we will fall short of mobilizing the 100 billion, or we're certainly not going to be well meeting that. And I think we need to be very proactive about what we're going to do about that. I think loss and damage as a term is toxic. Because it can imply compensation and liability, and everybody knows that won't be agreed, and everybody knows that if you did agree, you'd probably block US re-entry forever. So, but the concerns underlying loss and damage are real. We have to get much smarter about finding real policy solutions and real policy moves that can address the underlying concerns about loss and damage. It's only if we can do that can we begin to build robust and sustainable alliances with the vulnerable countries. So that's my pennyworth, Bob.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Pete Betts Unplugged for the first time, talking about the COP. So now going to ask Salam, if you're happy to, up to 10 minutes reflections on what happened in Madrid. Over to you, Salam.
Thank you. I'm Salam. I work with the African Group of Negotiators. Maybe this could be a reflection of the African group expectation for the COP and what we really achieved. I think to start off, the key term for this COP was ambition. For African ministers, ambition, when they talk about ambition, it's not really only limited to raising ambition on mitigation, but it's also about raising ambition on adaptation, because it's very key for African countries that's being impacted by the impacts of climate change. And the third was ambition with regards to means of implementation. The finance, technology, and also capacity building for African countries. So maybe to provide a bit of a context on that, so for us, ambition on mitigation was linked to pre-2020 and post-2020. Pre-2020 is very important because we want to ensure that the emission gap is not transferred to post-2020. The UNFCCC report indicated that developed countries are not in a way that will deliver the pre-2020 emission gap. So there has to be some kind of work done in order to ensure that this emission gap is not transferred to post-2020. And in the post-2020 NDC ambition, it was very important for developing countries, in particular African countries, to link this ambition to means of implementation. As you are well aware, as findings have indicated, African countries only contribute 4% of the total global emission. So, and all African countries have submitted ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions, to address climate change. So in order for them to achieve that, there is a link and there has to be a support coming from developed countries or partners. So, and that emission, that NDC contribution should also be linked to eradication of poverty, because some of African countries are living below the poverty line. Sustainable development is key for these African countries. So we came to the table with ambitious NDC mitigations. I think most African countries are already thinking of revising their NDCs, but for African countries, NDC means ambition in mitigation and also ambition in adaptation, because already African countries are paying 2 to 9% of their GDP for adaptation to reduce the impacts of climate change. So this is also some context from African countries. On finance, as Archie has indicated, one of the biggest achievements could have been a discussion on the long-term goal, on financial goal, but unfortunately, parties were not able to reach an understanding or an agreement on how they could continue this discussion and what the long-term finance would look like under the convention and also under the Paris Agreement. It was very unfortunate because this was very important as an indication for African countries to raise their ambition so that they would know this is the financial resource out there to help you implement your NDC. But as clearly, there were some countries, some European countries that clearly committed to this long-term finance. Germany, UK were also among these countries, and it was very unfortunate that we couldn't get a decision on that, because one of the key elements was to recognize countries like this that have contributed to the finance. The second point was the transparency arrangements and also support for the transparency arrangements. So post-2020, we are entering a new transparency, meaning countries will be reporting on their implementation of their efforts, their action. One key thing is, for example, the US, which is around 18% of the total emission, have stopped communicating on their efforts to reduce these emissions. Since 2015, they have stopped communicating on their national communication, which means they're reporting of what efforts they have done to reduce their emission, and also the biennial reports. It was only the African group that have been indicating this and raising this. Unfortunately, our other partners have not raised this, and we think that next year is an opportunity to remind them, because there is a clear intention and the withdrawal of notification has been submitted. Maybe there has to be some kind of process where countries like the US would be encouraged to submit that report. The other key and important issue is the arrangements. African countries especially this is very new, the reporting requirements under Paris on how they have implemented their climate action is important because that's how you link national efforts to the international frameworks, right? So institutional arrangements have to be there, national preparation have to be done. So the process of how these rules will be elaborated would have been a very key thing that would, I think African countries are interested in, because they need to prepare nationally on how they be required to report on. And the second is there was a support mechanism, a capacity building mechanism. It's called the CGE. It's an expert group that supports developing countries on how they need to be reporting on this, on their effort, on their climate action. Unfortunately, we were not able to also agree on that, on the arrangements, on the different trainings, on the training manuals, on how they could be reporting on their efforts. The third, I think this has been said, the markets for African countries, two things were important for the markets discussion. One was environmental integrity, because there has been some indication that parties may use the pre-2020 credits to implement their NDCs, which is a post-2020 commitment. So this was very key. We wanted to ensure that environmental integrity is key to the market mechanisms. And the second was the share of proceeds. I think to explain that a bit, from the market mechanisms, a percentage of that will be contributed to adaptation efforts of developing countries. This has been done under the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms, but this is not really clear. I mean, from Article 6, especially the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So it was very important for African countries that a certain percentage, 2% of that, similarly to the Kyoto Protocol, goes to this adaptation fund. This is important because the financial resources out there are not as African countries have hoped. So, but for the adaptation fund, with a direct access to implement their adaptation efforts is much easier than the GCF process, the Green Climate Fund process. So it was very important for them to see that from this market mechanism, from the internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, that this 2% goes to that fund. Hopefully this will all continue to be discussed next year, and hopefully that will reach a conclusion by next year. This year was the 25th year of the UNFCCC, so I think the multilateral process is something that the African countries are keen on. African ministers have clearly indicated that they see UNFCCC as a multilateral process to address the key multilateral process to address climate change, but it's very also in the same line that ambition is linked to, again, sustainable development and eradication of poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salam. I'm going to ask Alina now for her comments, up to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, previous speakers have given a pretty profound overview of what has happened in the formal negotiating space. My focus at the COP was more on the side event program and all of the developments which were happening in parallel. So my comments will be focusing mainly on that. And I think three important things or themes have been addressed through this side event developments. One on finance, which links both to the public finance commitments and progress on 100 billion, but also shifting to the wider discussions around, broader discussions about greening the financial system and moving to trillions beyond 100 billion. The second theme is how to enhance domestic implementation and enable countries to be credible and more ambitious in their efforts nationally. And thirdly, a number of important commitments were put forward by private sector in terms of enhancing ambition. So I'll talk briefly about each of those. So I think as previous speakers mentioned, very important issue for this year, but also for the next COP, is the progress on the implementation of the pledge made by developed countries to mobilize up to 100 billion annually to help developing countries in addressing adaptation and mitigation. Assessments this year by OECD have shown that as of 2017, this is the latest data we have internationally, collectively we are at about 71 billion US dollars annually in mobilization of public and private finance, which is still short of 100 billion, but 100 billion could still be within reach, in particular if previous progress continues. So if we look at where the progress has been made, public finance, public international climate finance has gone up by 44% between 2013 and 2017, which is pretty good progress, most of which has been achieved through multilateral development banks and mobilization of finance from multilateral development banks, where we're still seeing there is some progress, but where still more effort needs to be done is on mobilization of private finance, and that has been much of the discussion on the side of this conference of the parties. How can we increase mobilization of private finance, both through public finance provided through multilateral development institutions, through bilateral channels, but also what can be done to go beyond to green financial system at large. And what I have noticed at this COP, very positive energy from the investment community. There have been a lot of discussions on the taxonomy. Those of you who follow these developments in the European Union at the moment, there is some work being done by investors and regulators to come up with taxonomy for investments, which would allow to clearly distinguish which ones are compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. There was also a lot of energy around regulatory interventions, such as the ones implemented in France based on recommendations by the Task Force on Financial Disclosure, which would require investors to be transparent in their portfolios, which of their assets are exposed to climate risk or are invested in high carbon assets. So I think there was a lot of discussion, and I think in various parts of the world quite a lot of work is being done on that. And importantly, I think Nick will talk more about that because he's very directly involved in this, but the coalition of finance ministers, 51 countries have joined that coalition, has been very active at the COP, and that is an important outcome not to be overlooked. Now, in terms of building ambition domestically, at this COP, there have been a lot of discussions on the role of climate legislation, and we as an institute participated and co-organized many of those. And much of that discussion centered on how do we build political support for more ambitious climate laws. And of course, key themes in that were, what is the narrative that we need to create around the benefits of climate legislation? How do we ensure alliances with key stakeholders going beyond traditional kind of party groupings, but actually engage with private sector and wider parts of the society? And in this context, in particular, given what is going on in Chile at the moment with social unrest, protests in other parts of Latin America and other world, I think this COP was very much about social justice. I think we mentioned last year just transition emerging as an issue. I think this time it went much broader than that. And I think the message was that climate justice equals social justice, and we really need to look at other ways of engaging society at large into the process of developing and implementing climate policy. It has to come down from the cabinet level to engage the population. And in this context, a very important discussion was to what extent UK's model, which everyone recognizes is one that in terms of Climate Change Act and how UK has approached climate policy, it's very much seen as a model to draw from and to learn from. But many countries ask to what extent the flexible approach that UK has in terms of setting the overall framework and the carbon budgets, but then leaving the government a freedom to come up with underlying policies, whether this is appropriate for all countries or whether one wants to go into more detail and try to develop more detailed legislation. So I think these are some of the issues that have come up very strongly and probably will draw into the next year. And just to close, and I think one important issue we touched on this COP for the first time was the role of legislation in addressing adaptation. And just to close, I think Pete gave very useful advice on what the challenges and potentially opportunities are for the UK's presidency for the COP. From my time at the UN managing climate negotiations, I would say another two things. One is it's very important for government to speak as one voice when they hold the presidency of the COP and to be united. And I think hopefully that would be possible. And finally, I think UK's leadership on climate legislation could provide an important lever, one of the potential levers to unite countries for greater ambition around this COP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. And I'm going to ask Nick now to make some comments, and I'm hopefully going to put some slides up behind him at the same time. Let's see if we can get the technology to work.
Is this one on? I'll need the slides in about 5 minutes, not instantly. So I want to follow the sort of direction of travel of the panel in going from the details of negotiations to the broader challenges of development and action on climate change. I've worked on development about 50 years now, and I've always seen the whole climate and development story as interwoven, and of course I'm not alone in that. Let me start by looking backwards very quickly over the last couple of years or so, because a lot has changed. I think there's a deeper understanding of the urgency. The idea that the drive to the low or zero carbon economy is a very attractive growth story has gained traction. I'm not saying that argument is over, but it's moving in a better direction. Net zero is now the basic language, and it's much better than 80% cuts by 2050 from 1990. That was always very mysterious. Net zero is the physics. If you want to stabilize temperatures, you've got to stabilize concentrations, and that means net zero. Even if, God forbid, you stabilize at 3 degrees, it still has to be net zero. And of course, the earlier you go to net zero, the lower the temperature which you stabilize. It couldn't be more obvious. And that has now correctly been moved to center stage of the language of what we and the targets of what we have to do. And that, I think, is real progress, because it's remarkable that when you had 80% reductions 1990 by 2050, they all thought they were in the 20%, whether they were a sector or a country or whatever. But net zero is net zero, and it drops straight out of the physics. And I think that has been a very important change. As others have said, the private sector and finance really are moving, and you've had this tremendously encouraging rise of the voice of young people. Now, those, I think, have been very significant changes in the last couple of years. Of course, the challenge is to build those into country action and international decision-making, and that's what we're talking about. So let me then move to what happened at the COP. It'll be a little bit what I did at the COP, and you know what it's like if you, as we used to play this game as students, you'd ask people on a Sunday morning to describe what happened on the Saturday night, and they'd all come up, although they were at the same place, they'd all come up with completely different descriptions. But subject to that, this is what I want to try to describe. The first is that LSE and Tsinghua University co-chair a global alliance of universities on climate. And we moved that along. I won't go into the details, but in our own discussions and in public events, we moved that along. The universities of the world are starting to get together, and they're getting together around how do you do net zero, whether it be China or Australia or Brazil or wherever. And I choose those examples deliberately, but they are all involved with us in that discussion on how to go net zero. The world doesn't just consist of governments. The Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate, the first time that finance ministers, with any kind of formality, got together at the COP. It's very important that they're not part of the UNFCCC, but the actions and that they choose to take and the policies that they choose to follow are very important. Action can drive negotiations, and negotiations can make action easier. But that two-way relationship is very important. And if the negotiations didn't move that much this time, they did move a bit, as we heard from Archie and Pete, but there's been a lot of action there, which I think is extremely important. Private sector, both the financial and non-financial part of the private sector, Coalition of Finance Ministers, and so on. I chaired a Chilean side event on, it had the arcane title of Article 2.1.c, but that was about aligning finance with the, essentially with the drive to the zero and lower carbon. And it was myself, and then all the rest of the panelists were from the private sector, finance side. And it was remarkable, the ambition. I mean, the very big one was the Japanese fund, 1.6 trillion, which was demanding of all the investors that because it doesn't invest itself, it gets people to do it for them, but it requires now pretty tough reporting and objectives from the people who are doing the investing for them. So that was very important. And I was involved in a multilateral development bank session on so-called just transition. I always try to give it a plural because there's lots of transitions going on. But then again, that's absolutely centre stage with the MDBs, underlining what Alina said. And I mean, we also had meetings of the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and that is remarkable how the technological side of that is changing. You know, direct air capture, for example, I can't go into it all, but is really starting to come down in cost. I mean, it's still probably a couple of $100 a tonne, but it's moving very quickly, and other aspects as well. So whether you look at business, finance, technology, interaction of universities, interaction of finance ministers, there's a great deal going on which is reported on and is shared at these COPs, but is, as it were, interwoven, but also not part of the formal process. Let me turn then now to say a few words on some countries. We've already, the US, Brazil, Australia, Saudi, that I'll use the carefully chosen language of the Bank of England, were unhelpful. And other countries sort of shelter a bit behind unhelpfulness. But we shouldn't give up. They will change, and it's our job not to point and wave fingers, but make it as easy as possible for those countries to change by carrying on, making good progress, showing how investments can be driven by this whole story and innovation of the move to low carbon economy, for example. I spoke at the Indonesian event around their low carbon development initiative, where they're building in to their long-term development plans the whole idea of going low carbon. It's they're working on the details, but they're on not asking whether, but asking how they should do that. That was very encouraging. The EU Green Deal was announced on Wednesday of last week. It's very good. I mean, read the document. I hope they deliver, but it's a good document. We, in the UK as well, in the middle of his euphoria at, I think, about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning on Friday, the Prime Minister mentioned directly, as part of what was going to be done and what was voted for, zero by 2050. Now, the things that come to mind in those moments are significant. And he also, I think, mentioned that it was a Corbyn-free Christmas as well. But the key thing was that public commitment at that moment to the recommitment. Of course, the commitment's already there, to zero by 2050, and seeing this as part of the big growth story, the new role of the UK in the world. Africa as a whole, Islam has commented very clearly on that. Now, Africa has been strong from the beginning. This was my 14th COP, and I remember very well Copenhagen, which had its many minuses, but also some of its pluses. And one of the big pluses there was Meles Zenawi. I was working very closely with him, but Meles Zenawi pressing for the 100 billion, and that's where it got. That we wouldn't have had that without Africa's action, and Africa has been consistent and strong on that. And one of Meles's famous statements was that this was in COP 17 in Durban on Africa Day, where he pointed out very clearly that it is not justice to foul the planet. These are his words. It's not justice to foul the planet because others have fouled it in the past. So what we have to find is ways forward to drive that transition, which is to the lower zero carbon economy, and make sure that it's all part of an integrated development and adaptation story. They are intimately, those three things, development, mitigation, adaptation, bound together. And I was at an event in the Green Zone, which was exactly about that, how all this was related to sustainable development goals, which are all about, of course, that development, adaptation, mitigation bound up together, and we should salute Africa for its championing of that. Now, I've worked in India for 45 years and China for 31 years, and let me say something very briefly about that. Have we got the slides now?
Yeah, they're up behind you.
Yeah. There's this thing called trust. Trust on what the rich countries are doing in terms of their own emissions, trust in terms of finance. And trust has to be earned, and there's a history now. In COP16 in Cancun, commitments were made, following on from COP15 in Copenhagen. And commitments were made for 2020, both in terms of the rich country emissions and in terms of finance. You heard from finance from Alina on the 100 billion. Well, how have we done? I won't repeat what was said about the 100 billion because Alina has been at the core of the analytical side of what's happening. I'll say a word on what should happen next. Well, the rich countries, because remember at COP16 in Cancun in 2010, it was the rich countries were obliged, the Annex 1 countries that were obliged to make commitments, not the not the non-Annex 1 countries. So that is a little graph of how well they've done in meeting by 2020 what they committed to in 2010 at Cancun. I mean, sort of shrug your shoulders, not that bad, but not great, and quite a bit of missing, yeah? So the trust story is one that's related to what people actually said they'd do in 2010 for 2020. And it's not awful, but it's not that encouraging. These slides, I take it, Patrick Curran here put them together, and I take it that they can be made available. Can you go on to the next one? So let me just say, Bob, before, if the blue blob is above that, is higher than the yellow line, then they've done worse. So if you take New Zealand, they said they've cut by 5%, and they have increased by 23%. So that's how you interpret what's here. The EU said at the time that they would go down 20%, and they went down 23%, although they did also say later they'd go down 30%, which is obviously was not achieved. So you can see it's a mixed story, but quite a lot of non-achievement there. If we go on next slide now. This is the total emissions from the rich countries. Now, one of my Indian friends, actually one of my oldest Indian friends who's been involved in all this, I think I'm okay in saying his name is Kirit Parikh, who has been involved in all this for a very long time and one of the great energy and climate people in India, he said, look, you know, you guys in the rich countries talk, and what's happened since 1990? He said, the Annex I countries' emissions have hardly changed. Well, that's true. It is true, and it's important, and it's a problem. But at the same time, you can see that now it's starting to go down. There was a big drop around 2008, for which minimal credit is granted. You'll remember the financial crisis. But it's gone down. So that story is, again, it's a mixed story. It's one where if you look now in 1990, not much change. So the curate said, what are you guys up to? What are you doing? You know? I said, well, you know, it is going down. He said, but still, you know, it since 1990 hasn't changed that much. So again, you have the trust story. 100 billion, well, Alina has said it should be by 2020. I was involved with Melis Zenawi in negotiating that in Copenhagen. And I was negotiating on his side, not on the rich countries' side, I should say, as an honorary African in that case. But it's still quite a long way short. But this now, but let me say something about China and then come back to that very briefly. China now is trying to find a way to lead. Our friends in China are talking about zero by 2050, not in terms of necessarily, indeed they're not promising to do that, but they're analysing it, they're thinking about it, they're working out what could be done, what sorts of investments would be necessary. They're on the case. Now don't get me wrong, I do not think that China will commit to zero by 2050 next year, but they're working it out and they're thinking it through, and that's a very important story. They're very careful not to raise expectations, but there's no doubt that the analysis is taking place. The leadership story with the EU really does resonate, and there's a tremendous opportunity there. Like most opportunities, you can make a mess of it, but at the same time, I think that is something of great importance. And Pete mentioned the Leipzig summit, September, I think, isn't it, Pete? That will be very important. And this is a crucial thing for the UK to work together with the EU to try to achieve. And one of the positive stories, I mean, it's rather a local one for those internationally, but the UK and the EU are working quite closely together on the climate story, and it's very important that they do, particularly, of course, in 2020, but way beyond that. And I think, Archie, you probably can't say very much, but the signs are quite positive that the EU and the UK are working quite closely together on all this. So China was always very cautious. China will not say what it plans to do unless it's convinced that it can do it. China's unusual in that respect, but they are looking at these issues very carefully. I'm not raising expectations here, but I'm pointing out that there's a very live discussion in China. There are also problems in China that growth is stuttering, and at moments like that, you can either go back to boosting demand in what you know, the old story, or you can go hard for the growth story of the 21st century. And that discussion is still taking place. So we don't yet know in China how that will play through. But the 14th five-year plan, 2021-2025, which will be settled during the course, but the second part of next year, but discussions going on now, will be a very important part of that story. So the last slide there, could you just pick that up again, Bob? That's looking, it's unpacking that overall Annex I story into a few of the key countries. UK's record is really quite good in all that, remembering, of course, that this is production, not consumption. The consumption graph looks a little bit different and much flatter, of course, than that one. So the way forward, it seems to me, is to drive on. Action drives negotiations, negotiations foster action. To drive on, ambition needs finance, finance follows ambition. So it means that if we really want to move the negotiations forward, moving them forward on the action that we take as rich countries, moving them forward in terms of the help we give to developing countries in the actions that they're taking, working with the private sector, working with finance. Davos this year, and we've had some part in this, the theme for Davos this year is stakeholders for a sustainable and inclusive world. That discussion in the private sector is really active now, and the action is not everywhere, but it's moving. So what I want to emphasize, what I'm saying, is that in many places that really matter where you look, there are strong signs of action. Now, everything has to be, in the same sentence, you have to say, but nowhere near fast enough. But those signs of action are what we have to build on, and that we can build on in the drive to COP26 next year and beyond. But as we do it, the question of trust between the rich countries and the poorer countries is fundamental. How do we build that trust? We press ahead with the action ourselves. We help them in what they're doing through finance, and importantly also, I haven't got time to develop it, also through technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So we are now going to, we've got about 20, just over 20 minutes for questions to the panel. Questions are preferred, and concise questions. I'm going to take them in batches of 3. And when you ask your question, unless your attendance here is a complete secret and you want nobody to know, please say your name and any affiliation you want to declare. And if it's for a particular member of the panel, please indicate that. So I'm going to ask people for hands up if they want to ask a question. Yes, come to, and I prefer in these questions to start with a female voice, because it does usually change the, there we go, very good, a volunteer.
Hi, thank you very much. It's Margaret Ansblon with the Climate Markets and Investment Association. I'd like the panel to comment, so I'm guessing Alina and Nick, but others as well, around private sector and adaptation, because there's quite a bit of finance flowing into mitigation, though it's not enough, but really around adaptation and what could be done to help increase that and to show the business case and the business opportunities to share. Thanks.
Good. And we'll take a second question.
Ian Goff, visiting professor at LSE. This is a simple question. What is the scope, if any, for US states, progressive US states, to somehow bypass the federal government and raise ambitions?
Good. And one more question here.
Just following on, Robert Faulkner, Grantham Institute. Should the US withdraw, what are the plans to contain that impact at the next COP?
Okay, 3 questions. Who would like to start from the panel?
I could have a go at the first two. The private sector and adaptation. Look, 2 parts, really. I emphasise very strongly that mitigation, adaptation, development are bound together. Think of restoration of degraded land. Think of system of root intensification for rice and other cereals. Think of public transport. Think of strengthening schools so that they can be places where people can congregate in the event of extreme weather events. All of these are, in various ways, mitigation, adaptation, development integrated together. So I'm very cautious about some kind of horse race between adaptation on the one hand and development on the other, and mitigation. If you take that perspective, then what you're financing are development projects. Now, some of those will have revenue streams which can be associated with them. Public transport, some ways restoration of degraded land. They're not always revenue streams that are easy to put together. But in those cases, you want to see how those revenue streams can be constructed so that private finance can play a role. Often it will be the case you need to integrate that with financing from development banks or from concessional aid. But I think there are routes into that. Where it's preparations for disaster relief, when things have happened and you have to react quickly, then it seems to me that in many cases you'll need concessional monies. And, the private sector can help with the delivery and will need to help with the delivery. But probably in those cases, most of the financing would have to come from public sources, whether it be bilateral aid, MDBs, philanthropy, and so on. But what you do need to do in those cases is draw on the private sector to help, because what we know is that if people have purchasing power, the supply side generally works. It arrives. Yeah. So that's private sector delivery would be very important, but private sector finance not necessarily. And you don't want that to get caught up with sort of rigid rules. Hurricane hits Jamaica. Jamaica has explained to Jamaica that it's not a very poor country and it's highly indebtedness, so you're not sure you're going to help. That's not a good idea. So you have to think those through as well. So, but the motivation behind your question that adaptation, where adaptation is particularly prominent in the mix, it's not so easy to get private finance, I think is right. And that does give you a focus for those other forms of finance. US states, well, many people have a view on that, but let me just report one thing from my Chinese friends. I mean, Xie Jianhua, who has led the China's negotiations for years and years, way back to COP15 and earlier, is spending quite a bit of time talking to California and different parts, and that's where he was when he went to the US. So I think actually, the relationship between other countries, of course China the most important in this sense, and the decentralized parts of the US is something that is genuinely active.
Pete, next.
Thanks, Bob. So just on the question about private sector and adaptation, so one of my other hats, I work for a big reinsurance risk management company called Willis Towers Watson, and they put together this big coalition precisely on building resilient infrastructure. So briefly, if you want to build a bridge in any part of the world and you want to build it resiliently, it doesn't cost an extra 30 or 40% as people think. It typically costs an extra 2 or 3%. But if you want to borrow to finance that bridge, you pay the same interest rate if you build it resiliently or if you build it non-resiliently. And a lot of that is apparently because the banks don't have the methodologies to calculate the value of the lesser risk that you have from building resiliently. So the notion is that we will develop this methodology which it draws on insurance techniques, but it's not an insurance product. It draws on this on all of that methodology to better quantify those risks, and then the banks can offer a lower interest rate. Not only that, the banks can also develop different products so that you don't even pay more up front. And clearly that won't work, as Nick was saying, in all parts of the world, so you definitely need a public finance complement to this initiative for the more vulnerable parts of the world. But I do think that's an extremely exciting and positive thing. Second thing, again, I agree with what Nick said about the US states. I think they're doing great stuff, cities as well, and I maybe should have said a few words about that in the beginning. But, being frank, it's not enough. I think, as Fatih Birol always says, if you want to get to well below 2, let alone 1.5 degrees, you have to pull all the levers. And federal government, like any central government, just has many, many levers which the states don't have. They set standards. They have big budgets for innovation, for infrastructure. They just not to mention their kind of diplomatic weight. So we shouldn't kid ourselves. It is a problem that the U.S. federal government is not with us, as it were. They may become so again, albeit there's a huge amount very positive happening in US states. Just on the third point, and Archie may have was on this as well. Frankly, the biggest event that's going to dominate the reporting of the COP next year is going to be the US election. And you've basically got two scenarios. You've got a scenario where Trump wins. So then, I suspect, and this isn't going to be very easy for a UK government looking to build bridges with a Trump administration, you're going to need some kind of declaration. We're still going ahead. We're going to do this. You're also going to have to tell a real economy story. You're going to have to say, well, in spite of yet another 4 years of Mr. Trump, the real economy is shifting. To be frank, that story is slightly less resonant with Trump in the White House for 4 years, but it still is true. All the stuff that Nick was talking about what's happening, and Alina, in the private sector and elsewhere is true. But it's it's clearly sort of a challenging scenario. On the other hand, we'll have found out that it's the Democrat has won, and I think all of the Democratic presidential candidates are very positive about action on climate. So there, I think you can tell a much more compelling real economy story. Of course, one scenario, and Archie won't want to talk about this, I suspect, is that the new Democratic president-elect says, well, I'm up for this, and I'm definitely up for a new NDC, but I'm not ready. And I'm going to do this in a year's time. And China thinks, well, we're doing a huge amount, but we like to underpromise and overcommit, like Nick was saying, and we're a bit nervous about whether this new US president might tie climate to trade and so on. So we'll hold our cards back as well, and we won't shift our NDC until we see the colour of the US money. And then you basically would see all of the action on the NDC ambition raising shifted, potentially to a COP25 bis, COP26 bis rather, in the middle of the year, but possibly more likely to an African COP at the end of 2021.
I'm going to ask Alina, but let me just remind people of the timetable next year. So the US election is on the 3rd of November. On the 4th of November, the United States will complete withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and then COP26 starts on the 9th of November, and the new president will take office. Well, the new presidential term will start in January. But Alina, you've got some comments.
I just wanted to come very quickly on the question of adaptation and private sector. I think one other aspect that is important to note, that private sector themselves need to adapt, and I think that's a very, very important element of adaptation strategies in different countries. And private sector is quite good in responding to risk and return signals. What they really need are very clear risk assessments at the national and regional level, which is where the government's role comes in. So I think if that is what we also need to have globally and for particular countries, and particularly for highly vulnerable countries. And we're still missing that in some of the regions.
Salam, do you want to?
Sorry, maybe very briefly on the private sector and adaptation. I think due to the need that there is an increase for finance, it could be an important consideration, but one key important thing, especially for African countries that are already in debt and that already are investing a lot on adaptation, public finances. Public finance could play a role. That's should be the key source. But as have been said, if public finance can address the additional interests or additional pay, or the risk is covered through public finance, maybe I think that's something that we need all to consider, taking into account the financial resources out there are not as at the need of developing countries. And one key thing on the US withdrawal, as has been said, the US was the official withdrawal process takes a year. But one important thing is the US is still party to the convention. So as all parties to the convention, we need to work on how we make sure that their commitment under the convention is still on the table, and we also need to discuss on how we can make sure that their commitment under the convention is made, and including the national communication report. These reports are under the convention. The African group has been saying and will say in the next COP that they need to meet this reporting requirement. So I think it's also important that we take into account that their there are still a convention party. They need to meet their obligation under the convention, and that's very key in having the discourse and putting that still on the table and discussing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Archie, do you want to make any comments? Not compulsory, but...
No, I will. Thank you. So firstly, on adaptation, and I think the panelists have given very helpful answers on that. There is, it is absolutely true that public finance is crucial in terms of supporting adaptation around the world. But also adaptation means so many different things to different people depending on where you are. There's one paragraph in the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which actually does a beautiful list of examples of different types of adaptation. And it really brings home that just what a wide spread of activities it is. But for some of those activities, absolutely public finance is crucial. But for others, depending on how you calculate your economic horizon, actually, climate resilient investment is just smart investment. It's about really understanding, are you investing in something which is going to dramatically lose its value for factors perhaps outside of your control? And if so, how smart is that investment and how can you make it more resilient? And yes, that may be a small amount, it may be more, but it's still, that needs to be taken into account in that financial decision making. We need the innovative financial instruments to enable that investment to take that risk into account. But also, I think we need decision makers to really be factoring climate change into all of the decisions that they take. Then on US at state level, it was very interesting. There was an event at COP25. Michael Bloomberg set out a few scenarios in terms of what was happening at the state level and at federal level. I think he set out, if it's just the federal action alone, or if you have states doing what they currently commit to, or if you have states going further and faster. And what was clear from that was that actually the opportunity for a large proportion of the US economy, and therefore a large proportion of the global economy, is committing to accelerate their climate action. And we shouldn't ignore that, and we need to take that into account in terms of all of our projections and considerations. Then the scenarios for the US withdrawal, I think other people have set out the numerous different scenarios that there are. We're planning for this, and we're talking to the US about this as well. Right now, 11 months out, to say this is the plan, I think would be a bit presumptuous. But rest assured, it is very much on our radar. Yep.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take 2 very quick questions and ask for very brief answers from the panel. So we'll have... well, you can always set out an ambition, greater ambition. So would you... one in the front here?
So, given the rather gloomy prognosis that we've had...
Would you mind just
Jill Duggan, Associate Fellow, Chatham House. Given the very gloomy prognosis we've had so far for next year, are there things that could be achieved in advance of Glasgow to make it a Paris rather than a Copenhagen? And, given that everybody in the room probably wants that to be the case, what can we do?
And then one here, just on the right here.
Thank you. Mark Guillet from Ankara Consulting and currently advising EDF Energy on the Sizewell project in Suffolk. And it's a bit linked to the first question, which is, it's almost the holiday season. If you had one thing on your wish list that you would want to put ahead of next year, what would it be? And maybe if you can focus on energy generation as one personal interest in it. Thank you.
Well, we're going to assume that everybody on the panel is on Santa's good list this year, and so they do get a wish. So who wants to start? Very brief answers, please, because we're going to finish on time. Unlike the COP.
Yeah, I've never believed on climate that there's a one thing. I think that's delusional. If you're going to go zero by 2050, you've got to move on all fronts. I think the hard-to-abate sectors are where we should be focusing our attention now. There's lots you can do in cement and steel, air transport and sea transport. And I think that's also my answer to Jill, is that if we can really see the real economy start to move, strong action in the EU during the year, increased activity in finance and in the private sector. I know it's only 11 months away, but we really could see pickup. And that, I think, would, as I said earlier, action can drive negotiation, and I think that could be a really big driver. The biggest driver, probably, because it can move very quickly, is finance, the private financial sector.
Pete, quick response?
So I'm by nature gloomy and half empty, so maybe I'm the one you think has been negative. I think a lot can be done next year, and I agree with Nick that I think the finance piece is potentially really powerful. Mark Carney has said in terms that he sees the time coming quite soon when disclosure, for example, will be mandatory. I think all of that area, and Nick knows far more about this than I, is a huge potential mover. I know the UK is seized of that. Secondly, just on the other, if I'm allowed a second one, it's very clear that we won't get raised ambition of national targets of NDCs that will get close to closing the gap for 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. That's very clear, and I worry about kind of expectation management, because there isn't much scope for managing the expectation of kids on the street who are understandably extremely angry about this. Somehow we have to, in spite of the story that Nick told, where developed countries, the EU apart, have generally not delivered, that is the countries who really matter are right now, because of their size of their emissions and the growth of their emissions, are China and India. And of course they look at what we've done and they quite rightly think, well, why should we pick up the slack? But so somehow we've got to try and get the right dialogue, particularly with China in Leipzig, where China and others are willing to move. They are doing a lot in the real economy. But we have to build the right conversation, and we have to build pressure on everyone. We don't want to pick China up, but we need to build pressure collectively for raising of ambition in difficult geopolitical context. But we shouldn't be negative. I think we can achieve things next year. We should just be realistic. It's not going to be the slam dunk thing that's going to solve the problem.
Thank you.
It's not just picking up slack. It's driving a new model of development, which China and India are both seriously interested in. But at the same time, that needs big investment, and big investment needs big finance. We have to bring down the cost of capital, and that is of fundamental importance, and the MDBs and concessional finance will matter to that.
We're very in danger of going into overtime, but I'm going to allow each of the panel to say something. So Alina next.
I think it was 5 minutes just for
Well,
me.
I won't repeat what was said, but I think another lever, we need to build on the momentum in the private sector. Just between September summit and the COP25 Global Compact doubled the number of companies which have committed to science-based targets to get to 1.5 degrees and to net zero. If we can double, triple, or maybe quadruple that for the next COP, I think that would be a very important step forward.
Thank you, Alina. Salam?
Very briefly again, I think it's key that the current development models we have seen, especially for African countries, are directly linked to emission. So it's very important from our partners to see that there are alternatives to do development and sustainably increase our economy. So I think maybe it's very important that maybe the key theme should be ambition. I think all African countries want ambition, but that ambition has to be linked to finance. Ambition has to be with regards to adaptation. So we need to have this narrative that ambition is linked to finance. Thank you.
And the last word to Archie.
Thank you. So on the wish list, given that in some countries, I think if you have been a bad child, Father Christmas gives you coal. I'm tempted to use that as an analogy. But taking action on coal is clearly one of the quickest and most straightforward and most economically viable things that one can do to take action on climate change. The Secretary General has been very clear that he wants to see no new coal being put on the system. So that would be there. But actually, it's probably taking a step back from a sector specific. You asked for energy specific. That's my answer on that. But it has to be new NDCs. We have to, look at decision from Paris, paragraphs 23, 24, 25, and it is clear that countries are expected to come forward with new NDCs, highest possible ambition, and we need to be reminding them of that. But it's not just countries. We really want to see, and this goes into Jill's question, I think we can be optimistic about Glasgow. I'm not gloomy. I'm tired from Madrid, but I'm not gloomy, because the opportunity to really corral and push for greater ambition, both from countries, but also the momentum and acceleration that we're seeing from the private sector, from civil society, put that together, add that up, see where does that take us, and send that message to the world. Also, we haven't mentioned the proximity to the Convention on Biodiversity, which is happening the month before in October, and that should be a crucial moment in terms of the global approach on biodiversity. And I think there's a real synergy between the action that can be taken there on nature and also at COP26. And then I think the UK, and I will just kind of thump for a second, I think we are in a good position to lead on this. The graph behind us that Nick put up shows that we've reduced our emissions by more than any other country on that list, certainly, over 40% reduction since 1990. We led the call for action on adaptation and resilience for the climate summit in September. We've just doubled our international climate finance to 11.6 billion from 21 to 25. We published a green finance strategy. We've committed to net zero. Hopefully we can stand at the podium in Glasgow from a position of strength and get others to come with us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And that's it. Thank you all to the audience for your succinct questions, but please join me in thanking our panel. Let me just finally thank the organisers, Patrick Curran and Rebecca Burns, my colleagues Zoe Williamson and Ginny Pavey. So you give them a round of applause. And thank you.
You didn't thank us for being successful.